Adam,
Yes.
peace be with you.
And also with you.
Oh, you got it!
Wait, is that the Star Wars one? May the Force be with you and always with you?
Close enough. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we look at protests and revolutions, past and present, and see what lessons we can take with us today. I'm Sam, and joining me, as always, is a man I'm not fully convinced wouldn't get burned by holy water. Adam, how are you today?
I'm doing well. There were occasions when I would enter a holy space, perhaps on a school trip or something, and the question would arise, would I get burnt with holy water? Hasn't happened yet, but I don't have a robust data set to find out, so...
Well, you and I have been in a few holy places together, just as observers, but I don't think we've been in a Catholic church yet, which is the one that counts, so maybe one day.
Bold claim. You heard it here first, folks. The one true religion, Catholicism.
I think South Park established that was Mormonism, but anyway.
That's true.
Now, Adam, you may or may not be a bit confused about how I started the episode. Basically, I want to get us back into that spiritual mindset.
Okay.
We talked about Martin Luther. We had a break from that. We talked about Greta. That was a good time. But once again, we are talking about popes.
Okay.
But rather than just talking about the absurdity and the abuse of power over the centuries like we did last time, we're going to be talking about the modern day and one pope in particular, Pope Francis.
I remember him. He was a recent one.
Very recent. And following the theme of our podcast, it's not going to be the typical biography.
Cool.
But first, we have an Independence Day to celebrate. But it's technically not an Independence Day.
Oh.
It's a national day, and a very important one. July 14th. Do you know what day this is, Adam? You're from Europe. It's a big day there.
Of course I know what day July 14th is. That is Bastille Day, French holiday, where they liberated themselves from the Ancien Regime and stormed a big prison called the Bastille.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to ask you if you knew the significance. You hit the nail on the head. You're also our pronunciation guy on this podcast, so we'd be remiss if you didn't pronounce it in the correct way.
Bastille.
Okay, there you go.
No, we did it in school. I remember I had to write a whole... Actually, I had to record a podcast about it. I don't have that file anymore, but I remember I had to make like an audio walking tour through the concept of revolutionary Paris. And so it was going from the Jardin de Tuileries, and then that was one other stop. And the Bastille was also definitely in there, but I don't remember what went in between.
Wow. So it sounds like this podcast was your destiny all along. Everything in your studies was leading to this moment.
Could be.
As you mentioned, French government was toppled by the revolutionaries. This was more of a symbolic situation than the actual overthrow because the Bastille was the very old prison, medieval prison in Paris. And it wasn't super functional at that point anyway, but it was the representation of power within the city of Paris because the royalty did spend their time mostly outside of Paris. And it is very interesting to me when I was looking this up. A lot of countries recognize Bastille Day and have some form of celebration. I don't know if you had any in Switzerland or in England when you were growing up, but
none that I remember.
Belgium apparently has some celebrations, a lot of the French-influenced countries around the world. And I find it fascinating that the French government celebrates this so much, yet they condemn any form of political violence today.
Does the French government condemn political violence? I feel like political violence is the national pastime of France.
They always give their proper condemnation. That doesn't mean it's not exercised.
That's true. They do. I suppose they consider it a different state, right? Like we're on the Fifth Republic by now, and that was before we even had one, so you had to get there eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Destroying the Bastille was a stronger start.
Yeah, and congrats to our comrades in France. Keep fighting the good fight. We know there's always work to be done there, as Adam mentioned.
Félicitations, comrade.
There we go. Also, before we get started, shout out to Zoran Mamdani. I was very skeptical last week, but stand pleasantly corrected. He did win the Democratic mayoral primary in New York City, which I was very hopeful he would win, but very skeptical because all of the money of the Democrat establishment, as well as the people that fund Trump, were backing Andrew Cuomo. So it's very good to see a progressive politician that is a self-described democratic socialist win an election in America.
Yeah, put forward by the as the candidate for the Democratic Socialists of America, right?
Yeah, shout out DSA.
Shout out DSA, shout out Zoran. We're very happy for you in New York.
There's still a lot of work to be done, but let's hope he can get the job done in the autumn.
Good luck.
Now, Adam, when we talk about revolutionaries, we tend to imagine barricades, slogans, defiant manifestos, and toppled regimes. We don't usually think about popes. But Pope Francis, the first Latin American to lead the Catholic Church, quietly challenged that image. So let's run through his life a little bit.
Okay.
Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in the slums and seminaries of Buenos Aires, Argentina, he rose to power in an institution long aligned with empire, patriarchy, and wealth. And yet, from the moment he stepped onto the balcony in 2013, he spoke in a different register, denouncing capitalism, praising the poor, and warning of ecological collapse. Until his death this year, in April 2025, Francis remained a deeply polarizing figure, seen by some as a radical in white robes, by others as a reformer who never went far enough, and to those in conservative circles, a disgrace to the throne of Peter. In this episode, we explore Francis as a protester within the palace. Someone who, instead of hammering a thesis to the church door, like Martin Luther, tried to open it just wide enough for a breath of revolutionary air.
It's very poetic. I look forward to hearing about him.
Let's get started. Let's stop at some key points along the way of his life. We're not going to be covering everything. We only have a set amount of time, and we do not want this to be a hardcore history episode where we just keep going. Shout out to Dan Carlin, though. We would probably not be here. I wouldn't be here without his influence. So we'll be using him as a lens into the world he navigated and the revolutionary energy swirling around. And unlike Greta Thunberg, who we talked about last episode, who hopefully has decades more to live and impact the world, we'll be viewing Pope Francis's entire life, which was very much iconic in our contemporary world. When you think of the leaders we've had in this millennium, he's a name that would come up on a short list pretty quickly. Though his life is over, his legacy will live on. Any comments before we dive in, Adam?
I remember, well, throughout much of his life tenure as the Pope, then really early on there was side-by-side comparisons of Pope Benedict the 16th. He was the one before, Pope Benedict the 16th.
Yeah, he was.
On the sort of papal balcony versus how Francis appeared on the papal balcony. And night and day, Benedict was adorned like an emperor, right? Draped in gold and all of this decoration. And Francis had a simple white robe and a wooden chair. And that was quite stark and seemed to be more Christ-like.
Yeah. And some background on Adam and myself. Adam does not come from any Catholic background at all, but he is from various parts of Europe, so he is aware of Catholic traditions and their aesthetics. I was raised by a Mexican Catholic mother, but am no longer a practicing member of the church. So just our backgrounds for everyone going into this. And you're right, his imagery was completely different from the jump. Benedict was very much following the traditions of old, and Pope Francis was doing something pretty new. And maybe we'll understand why from his background. So to start, we're going back. Jorge Bergoglio was born in Buenos Aires, as I said, in 1936, but he wasn't born to Argentinians. His family actually immigrated in 1929 from Italy to escape Mussolini's regime. And remember that when we get into things in a little bit, because it might inform his decision making. When he was around 20, he got pneumonia that almost killed him and led to a partial removal of one of his lungs. Also remember that fact for later. And before he was a priest, he did various odd jobs, including being a janitor and a bouncer for a nightclub.
That's
you don't
cool.
need to remember that.
I'm gonna remember that. That's
There you go.
Does that nightclub still exist? Do you know?
I don't think so. I would have to look it up.
That would be so cool to go to the Pope's nightclub in Buenos Aires.
I mean, judging but from Argentina's infamous economy, I'd be surprised if bars from 5 years ago exist.
Right. Oh, poor Argentina.
They say there are 4 types of economies: developed, developing, Japan, and Argentina.
So I've heard. I don't really know what it means, but I have heard that.
I think it's just more a joke on the latter two. Yeah, we're getting off track.
It's never happened before.
Bergoglio entered training for the priesthood around age 22. In 1958, and he joined the Order of the Jesuits. Adam, do you know anything about the different orders of priesthoods or monks in the Catholic Church? I mean, we did mention that Martin Luther was an Augustinian.
I've heard of different orders, but I don't know a ton about their differing ideologies, nor how they relate to the sort of overall organizational structure of the church. When it comes to the Jesuits, I understand that they really focus on education. There's a lot of Jesuit schools out there. As I understand it, they're often pretty good schools as well. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, most of the Catholic universities, at least in the United States, I don't know about around the world, but most of the universities in the United States are Jesuit universities. Boston College, all the ones with the name Loyola in them, Seattle University, Xavier in Cincinnati. Those are a few I can think of off the bat. But yeah, the Jesuits are very big on education. The basics kind of to the orders in general is that priests cannot get married. That's in all the orders of the Catholic Church. And not all priests are in orders. Most priests are just diocesan priests, meaning that they are part of the local diocese where they work at one church and might be moved every decade or so. But the ones that are in an order, they usually live in a group at a specific church or a mission. And they have certain rules that they have to live by depending on the order they're in. Normal parish priests don't necessarily live in poverty. Mm-hmm. Jesuits, or members of the Society of Jesus, as it's officially known, it was founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola in 1540. They live by very strict tenets. Vows of poverty, including renouncing personal ownership of anything.
Wow.
Emphasizing seeing God in all things and people. Commitment to social justice, and a dedication, as you said, to education, with these universities being today a bit less conservative than other Catholic universities, emphasizing intellectual growth, curiosity, and building students into leaders.
Question about the Jesuits, and I suppose the orders in general. Do they occupy some sort of hierarchical position within the church, or do they have some special status, or how do they relate to the church as a whole?
Yeah, so good question. The orders kind of vary in their degree of interaction with the rest of the hierarchy, depending on the country they're in. Mm-hmm. Orders typically kind of operate autonomously. For example, their funding and everything like that is usually done in-house. Where they live and the communities they operate in are generally self-run. But depending on the community, they might be called upon to help out with local churches, local schools, things like that. It was very atypical to have a pope who was in an order before this.
You said before this, does that mean our new Pope Leo, is he also from an order?
He is, so it's very abnormal to have one pope in a century that is in an order, let alone two in a row. Leo is not a Jesuit, though. He is an Augustinian, just like Martin Luther. I don't know the Augustinian tenets as well as the Jesuits. They don't take as much of a vow of poverty.
Okay.
The Jesuits are as poor as it gets, as it were.
Okay.
But the Augustinians are still big on education and social justice.
Great.
Yeah. So in a historical context, we really need to understand the Argentina that Pope Francis came from. In Buenos Aires in the 70s and 80s, these were blood-soaked years of Argentina's military dictatorship. I don't know if you know a lot about that period, but there was a fascist junta waging a brutal campaign against leftists, trade unionists, students, and suspected dissidents in what came to be known as the Dirty War. And over 30,000 people were kidnapped, tortured, and killed. And the Catholic Church, instead of standing firm with the oppressed, largely aligned itself with the regime, which unfortunately is a trend that it had done historically up to that point. The Catholic Church, if you look in history, is all about self-preservation. You know, there were priests that did aid Jews in hiding from the Nazis, but then the Catholic Church of Germany as a whole did not. So this was kind of a similar situation. Jorge Bergoglio, a young Jesuit priest, he rose to become the head of the Argentine Jesuits at this time, and he did so at just 36 years old. Critics accused him of being too passive and even complicit in the persecution of two fellow priests who were kidnapped for their work in the slums. But later evidence suggests something a bit murkier, that Bergoglio, under immense pressure, may have quietly helped save a lot of lives, hiding people from the military, using church channels to get dissidents out of the country, and to navigate power from within. It wasn't loud resistance, it wasn't martyrdom, but it might have been something else. Survival with a conscience. He later admitted his silence during the dictatorship as a source of personal shame and called it a time of deep spiritual crisis. And this would be something that haunted Pope Francis for the rest of his life. But here's the question, Adam. If someone works behind the scenes to protect people, but doesn't speak out publicly, can that still count as resistance?
Resistance for sure. Revolutionary, possibly not. I suppose it depends, as with all things. A lot of what we talk about when we talk about the resistance in various contexts is effectively that, right? And sometimes resistance necessitates secrecy in order to be effective. Most famously, when you talk about the resistance in European historical context, you're talking about usually the French resistance during the Second World War, operating in sort of Vichy France to undermine Nazi occupation. And that necessitated acting in secrecy, in part because they didn't have the numbers, I believe, to really put up a proper fighting force against what was, an occupying army. And it's great to speak out against things, but I suppose certainly in an instance like the junta in Argentina and various other repressive regimes need a certain level of security. And maybe the head of a religious order has that security, but it's a tricky calculus to do, right, as to whether you're going to be more effective by speaking out against that and possibly being silenced by the state, or simply working quietly to try and save individual lives. I don't know what I would have done in that situation. I don't think it would have been obviously the wrong choice at the time, if that it was.
And I think if we're pulling it to modern day, there can be a parallel on the opposite end of people that do a lot of reposting of some social justice without actually getting their hands dirty.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's better to do so in silence, or to just be a voice but not any action? I don't know. But this brings up two branching questions I also have, because we did mention the French resistance, and that brings up fascism. So is silence in the face of fascism always complicity?
Ooh, that is a good question. Is silence in the face of fascism always complicity? I suppose it depends what you mean when you talk about silence, because Francis and indeed the anti-fascists of the 20th century would have not had the same availability of speaking out as we do today. You mentioned reposting things on social media, and that can feel a little shallow, I suppose, because the barrier to entry is so low and there's so much stuff out there to be sharing. That's indeed how those platforms work, is by lots of people sharing the same thing, so that lots of people see it. Obviously, there was not the same option to project that voice, and so it's maybe a little bit more effort to get your voice out there in those days, and there is more risk that comes with that. I think that what is key is a conscious action, regardless of whether or not you're being sort of outwardly loud about it, or if you're just sort of working quietly to get things done. I think that requires a certain consciousness of what's happening, and also at least a strategic consideration, right? It might not be that this is absolutely the best move necessarily. You don't have to be an expert in revolutionary tactics, but I do think a consideration of tactics is important, because that could end up being counterproductive, possibly.
Yeah, and we've talked about knowing your role a lot, but I don't think we've touched on knowing your role of waiting for your right time.
Sure,
Even if that may be waiting a long time.
Yeah. Which is not to say do nothing, right? It's about doing the prep that you can do in the ways that you can do it. But that's a good question, and I don't think sits easily, regardless of whether the right answer is to outwardly loud about something.
Well, I guess, what are the limits of quiet resistance, since we're on that topic? How do we ensure that it doesn't become complicity dressed up as caution?
Another good question.
And as you consider this, I mean, we can think of like whistleblowers in government and companies, or like citizens of repressive regimes today.
Yeah, I suppose that keeping quiet and working diligently is important and depends on the scope of your ambition. If you seek change, wider societal change, then that needs to be paired with efforts to build up the movement, which can be done in secrecy. It might become harder at some point, but I suppose it can be done. And when it comes to whistleblowers and things like that, I think there's always going to be lots of different factors playing into things like whistleblowing, because you may, as the person discovering this information, be wholly unequipped to do anything with it, build a movement. You might want to give it to some journalists so that they can figure out what to do with that and how to message that in a more sort of compelling way. Not necessarily, I mean, journalists often avoid having, or try to avoid having, an ideological bent. They often don't succeed, but they will report things in different ways, and once the story's broken, different news outlets with those different ideological bents will report them in different ways. Or you might not have the sort of time to do something properly with it. When you are a whistleblower for a big organization, there's going to be people who want to stop you from blowing that whistle. And sometimes a movement can only build with having access to that information. I suppose it depends a lot on the level of security that you're operating from and what you see as your own tolerance for risk. All of these things are going to be really tricky to work out the optimal way forward when you are in that position, I think. And as annoying as it is to give this as an answer, I think it depends on the circumstance, you know?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a hope of our podcast, is throwing a lot of information and advice at people, and hopefully people can bookmark some of them for an appropriate time and place that suits them, right?
Hopefully so.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. Back to the life of Pope Francis. Jorge Bergoglio's term as the head of the Jesuit order, because it is a set term limit, it's not just for life, it ended around the same time as the military junta did in Argentina. I think his term ended in like 1980, and then the dictatorship ended in 1983. Bergoglio set out on a period of self-reflection and growth. I think that running the Jesuits under the dictatorship really took a toll on him. He traveled to different Jesuit centers around the world to learn new things.
He went backpacking.
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool.
But he didn't have a backpack or anything in the backpack because he wasn't allowed to own one.
Sure.
He wandered like Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction at the end. So during this time, he began to embrace the concept of liberation theology, which in a Catholic form began in Latin America in the 1960s. But this was a form of theology that had developed in Protestant circles back dating to slavery times in the US. Just like how it was used by the likes of MLK, it was taking spiritual teachings and authority and using them to liberate the oppressed. This was touched on in our Protestant Reformation episode as well. It really has its roots there, if you remember the peasant uprisings.
Yeah.
So this became a point of tension between Bergoglio and the conservative Jesuits of the region, but he also was making allies amongst Argentina's poor and marginalized communities. I have a quote for you.
Okay.
From Francis, said much later, but that encapsulates this time period.
To be close to people's lives is not populism. It is the church being faithful to Jesus.
And that is from his book, Let Us Dream, from 2020. After his years in internal exile, Jorge Bergoglio didn't vanish. He reemerged transformed. In the 1990s, he returned to public life with a softened tone, but a sharpened sense of purpose. He was no longer the disciplinarian Jesuit. He'd become a priest of the people, and by 1998, he was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and eventually a cardinal, so then he had voting power on who the Pope would be. But unlike other church leaders in Latin America, Bergoglio didn't climb the ranks with spectacle. He chose to live in a small apartment instead of the bishop's mansion in Buenos Aires. He chose to remain in the poor neighborhoods that he had worked in for so many years. He cooked his own meals, and he rode the bus and the train to work instead of taking a limo, as was the tradition before. These weren't photo ops. They were part of a deeply consistent commitment to humility and proximity to the poor. And some of these neighborhoods were known as the Villas Miserias, which were Buenos Aires' most notorious slums. In these slums, Bergoglio was known not just as a religious figure, but as a protector. He clashed often with neoliberal economic policies pushed by the Argentine state and international leaders. He didn't wave banners, but he did something revolutionary for a man in his position. He always showed up. He was always there to support his community. Whether it was confronting government corruption or washing the feet of the incarcerated, Bergoglio took sides, and he made clear which side he was on.
It's always inspiring to see someone who really lives by their values. Seems like Pope Francis kept it up for his whole life, even once he took the papacy. This modesty.
I think we can respect how Pope Francis lived before he became Pope. You know, he was the cardinal who took the bus, and he chose poverty while surrounded by gold. And it's easy to be cynical about symbolism, but can that kind of public humility itself be a form of protest?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly in terms of rallying people to the cause. Is it going to be effective at generating material change? Possibly not. I suppose it depends on what you do with the riches that are there if you are in a position to do something about them. I don't know what powers the Cardinal of Argentina has, but I imagine as the Pope you have fairly broad powers. I imagine there are some fairly big treasures in the Vatican that are probably still there.
Yeah.
I don't know that he was giving them all to the poor, but I suppose you are the head of a state at that point, and there's other considerations to go into effect as well.
Yeah. And I have one more question about leadership and symbolism in protest movements. In today's movements, do you think symbolism like that still matters at all? So when leaders take risks with how they live, not just what they say, does that shift the culture of the resistance that they're trying to garner, or does it get dismissed as aesthetic politics?
Both can be true. The value in something like that is of having a symbol as a focal point for a movement, as something that people can see themselves rallying behind. But I think that the danger of that is that they're not a symbol, they are a human being, and it is exceptionally difficult for someone to live up to their role as a symbol, and how they wish to be a symbol might not be the symbol that the movement wishes them to be. I think this came up when we were talking about Greta Thunberg last week and how she started off as this symbol for what the establishment wanted the climate movement to be, which was a little girl asking nicely. And then when she was like, hang on, this is all your fault, and turned against them, then they lost control of the machine they had helped to create. And while I think that makes her a stronger candidate for a leader in the climate movement, she herself does not necessarily want that position, right? She's doing very well with being the symbol that she is, but I think that, humans are fallible, and making them the symbol of your movement, holding to a standard of moral purity, is dangerous for the movement and can often be unfair to the individual as well.
Yeah, well put. Moving on in the timeline, 2013, Pope Benedict XVI resigned. This was the first resignation of a pope in about 500 or 600 years at that point. When we're talking Catholic history, it's a very long scale. It's even longer than that Habsburg scale we mentioned.
Yeah.
But even at this point, no one thought Bergoglio would be elected. He was not any of the names, which, a tip for anyone betting on the papal conclave, it's never who the pundits think it will be.
Right.
Benedict was a hardline conservative. He was a theologian first and focused on tradition and hierarchy. As you said, when he came out on the balcony, he was decked out in the gold and the ruby slippers and everything. Side note, he was also part of the Hitler Youth when he was a kid.
Yeah, that's trotted out, but I don't think...
Not necessarily his fault. It's not all his fault, just a bit of his background.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of scandal under Benedict's regime. And after years of this, cover-ups, growing disillusionment with Catholics around the world, the conclave needed someone different. Not a progressive exactly, but someone with moral credibility, especially in the global south. Bergoglio, with his humility, his distance from Vatican power games, and his street-level ministry, was seen as a bridge, and maybe a gamble. And remember when I mentioned his lung that he had removed?
Yeah.
People thought this was going to be a very short papacy, because they didn't think his health was in the best shape. As we know, he lasted 12 years in the role, so he had enough time to make an impact. Adam, do you remember when Francis was elected? You mentioned it at the top, your initial reaction, but when he was announced as Pope, do you have anything else to add from that time in 2013?
This is embarrassing to admit now, but I think I was in something of a new atheist phase. There, but for the grace of God go I. And I remember it was I think the same week that Xi Jinping became the president of China. And I remember finding it slightly baffling that was receiving less news coverage than the new Pope, because there are about as many Chinese people as Catholics. So it seemed strange to me.
Can we verify that? Because I
can.
thought he was...
Let's check that out. Assumed office 14th March 2013.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're correct.
Same day, 13th March 2013. It was the same day that Pope Francis became the Pope.
So, yeah, half the world looking one way, half the other, pretty much.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we talked about our radicalization to the left in our final preseason episode. And when I think back, I mentioned meeting you and other people in London. I mentioned going to a Bernie Sanders rally. But I think the initial break to my hardened heart was Pope Francis, if I really think about it, because he stood opposed to a lot of the things that I had held as a Catholic identity before that, and I bought into his moral authority as head of the church, whereas a lot of people I knew didn't. And I heard the things he was saying, and that's maybe why Bernie Sanders and you and other people struck a chord, is because I'd heard it before, and it was with the Pope. So when I really think back on it, I think he was the very start of my radicalization in a small way, where it was incremental after that.
And did he carry his liberation theology with him into the papacy? And maybe could you talk a little bit more about that as well at some point?
We'll get into his papacy in just a moment. When I saw him walk out on that balcony, it was one of the most unique feelings I'd ever felt in my life. It was like this sense of calm, but also very overwhelming at the same time. And I was shocked to see this Pope that was not decked out in any of the traditional attire. He was just wearing a white robe. Even just his shoes were just like normal shoes. He had a watch that was like $20 on.
Were you at a church watching this, or were you at
I was at school.
Wow.
It was night in Europe, but it was day in California. So I was following all the updates on my phone.
Okay.
But yeah, he was the first Jesuit Pope, and even that announcement I knew was something different, and I knew he would be different. That day, he even went back to his hotel after all of the ceremony and paid the bill. I think it was just a sign of what was to come.
Wow.
There's a lot of pictures of that moment, as you can imagine. Because
Sure.
he didn't change. He just went straight to the hotel. He said, I have to pay my bill. Other people at the Vatican were like, no, sir, like, we can cover that for you. Don't worry. And he's like, no. I would feel remiss if I didn't pay my tab.
Power move.
A question before we move deep into his papacy. When looking at protests and revolutions, can lifestyle choices be a tactic in gaining followers or gaining attention? And are there limits to this? So right away, he attracted a lot of new people with his humility and how he was presenting it, because it was tactical.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, the aesthetics can help to build a movement, and often when you have revolutionary movement throughout history, there is a charismatic leader who the movement is centered around. That can be beneficial because it helps to gain momentum and helps to rally people around that individual, that cause. But it can also be challenging because at some point, if nothing else, that person will die, and then that charisma will have to be sort of institutionalized somehow and passed on to the next leader, which can historically lead to problems. In the Soviet Union, Lenin gave way to Stalin, who was not such a great guy. And of course, the individual themselves may be fallible. I think that given that the institution of the papacy is pretty rooted in one person anyway, then I think having a pope who then adopts aesthetics of change can be beneficial. But I wonder whether it was effective in changing things, or whether it maybe took away some pressure on the church to reform because its leader had these aesthetics. I don't know the answer to that and would be interested to find out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when he first emerged on that balcony in 2013, Pope Francis was clearly hitting a reset for the Catholic Church. Even his name, which was Francis the First. You don't see very many first instances of a papal name. Even his name was chosen to honor Saint Francis of Assisi, who is basically the Catholic Buddha because he gave up a life of riches to serve the poor. What the church got was more than just a clean reputation that was needed. They got a pope who wouldn't play by the games at all. You asked for some instances of him bringing liberation theology to the church. His first official visit outside of Rome, I believe if it wasn't the first, it was like the second or third, was to this island off the coast of Sicily, which is known as having a huge pit stop for migrants coming from Africa over into Europe, and was this kind of demonized place by conservative media in Europe, and he made it a point to visit there first and bless the people he encountered and make a point that migrants deserve the same dignity as anyone else. So that was just one of the first actions he did as Pope. So before we dive into more of his actions and what he changed, as someone who grew up outside of the Catholic Church, what was your general observation of it and popes pre-Francis?
Well, it certainly seemed like Francis was making more of a commitment to helping the poor. It seemed that he was really trying to be more Christ-like in that sense. You know, sell what you have and give to the poor. It is easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of the needle than to enter the kingdom of heaven, that sort of thing. And it seemed like he was really pushing for that. I don't know that it felt that it translated to the wider church at the time. And as for the popes before him, I know that I know that Pope John Paul II
He's a saint.
Is he really?
Now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I misspoke, but in a great way. It's Saint John Paul II. I know that he was very well regarded, and that Benedict the 16th was really not particularly well liked. and I don't know why necessarily. John Paul II, big football guy, as I understand it.
He was, yeah.
At least from where I was sat in Switzerland, and then the UK, and then I suppose Amsterdam, Francis was always seen in a much more positive light than certainly Benedict, and generally well regarded. I know that over the years there were some things that were flagged as, you know, maybe not as progressive as we would like. It is, I suppose, the Catholic Church at the end of the day, a several thousand-year-old institution. I remember he spoke sort of. It was interesting. I remember when gay marriage came up as a topic, and he sort of seemed a bit resigned to the fact that this is how the way the world is, but he didn't seem particularly happy about it.
I mean, on that note, he did change the church radically in a Catholic Church sense. That is to say, not radically, but he did. His famous phrase on that was, "Who am I to judge?" And a lot of conservatives said, "You're the Pope. You're supposed to judge that." But he said, "Who am I to judge?" And the part where people felt he didn't go far enough was recognizing it officially as marriage. But he said, "Look, it's a sacrament in the church. Like, I can't change that, but I can recognize these unions as not being inherently like sinful, I guess." But that upset both sides.
Yeah, sure.
It upset both sides.
Interesting. I suppose that's another biblical phrase, right? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone.
Exactly. From the outset, Francis refused the traditional trappings of power. He always wore simpler robes. That became a mainstay of his papacy. He stayed at the guest house instead of the apostolic palace for his whole time there, which was just to say like a little studio apartment amongst the staff. And looking back on it now, a lot of people say it's because he enjoyed the company of people. He didn't want to be isolated away from everyone, which goes both ways, because I guess the staff is always on their toes if the big boss is just next door.
Yeah.
But a lot of people did like that he was, not above them in that hierarchy, at least how he felt. But he spoke to people very colloquially as well. There was no formalities that he wanted, which usually went with the papacy. Even just the language used to talk to the Pope is usually, His Excellency this or that. He just wanted to be called Francis, essentially. And he didn't just live differently. He signaled a shift in tone, priorities, political messaging. He followed it up with substance. So within his first year, he released Evangelii Gaudium, a scathing critique of neoliberal capitalism, calling it a system that kills. Essentially, these writings, they're not official church doctrine, but they are papal doctrine in a sense.
Okay.
Like, you can go to these official readings if you want to know what a pope thinks about certain things.
Okay.
So he wrote another one called Laudato Si, where he issued an unprecedented encyclical on climate change, condemning both consumerism and corporate exploitation of the planet. And in Fratelli Tutti, he rejected militarism, nationalism, and market fundamentalism, directly challenging the ideologies driving the global inequality.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard of any of these.
I think you'd like Laudato Si since it's very environmental, but I have a quote for you from Fratelli Tutti.
Okay. Without a sense of responsibility for others and the world, our individual freedoms diminish and all rights are endangered.
These weren't just papal niceties. They were moral indictments, and they made people nervous in the church. American conservatives labeled him as a Marxist. Right-wing bishops resisted him. The Vatican bureaucracy, famously self-preserving, stalled, derailed, watered down many of his reform attempts. This was classic institutional suppression. So we talked about suppression before as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting to see it happening to the Pope.
Yeah, wow.
Disruption, misrepresentation, official channels weaponized to delay change without confronting the Pope head on, right? Because that's a no-no. But speaking of Laudato Si, I do have another quote for you.
The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Wow. Yeah.
Official papal words there from the pulpit of Peter. Thank you for listening to our first part of our Pope Francis episode. Make sure to tune in next week where we continue to discuss Pope Francis's legacy as a protest leader, but where we also project our hopes that Pope Leo can somehow continue on what Francis has started. In the meantime, stay safe and keep fighting the good fight.